The title of this lesson tonight is Christ and the Sabbath. And the reason that I've titled it this way is because there are lots of questions about the differences in the old and the new covenants and the things that were done then and now, and whether they are we're held accountable for them now. And how about Christ and the Sabbath? This is kind of an introductory lesson tonight. We will have probably about 2 more weeks on ins and outs of the Sabbath. This is in a searcher's class format, so if you desire to say something, it's fine, all right? This is not a sermon. The questions were asked. What does nailed to the cross mean? And in general, we think about the old law or sins or the various things we might say. It was also asked, should our love for God compel us to keep the 10 Commandments? I mean, after all, they're moral, aren't they? Well, some of them are and some of them aren't. Did the first century Christians keep the Sabbath? And there was a time period when you will find the apostles going into the synagogues, and they probably worship right along with the Jews on those occasions, but that soon stopped. And how can we tell what it means to break bread? Because all through the book of Acts, it talks about the breaking of bread. What does that mean? So we're going to be talking about those kinds of things over the course of the next probably month. This group of questions all revolve around the old and the new covenants. Now, what is a covenant? A promise, a will between two people. Okay? And if I go and I make a covenant, I'm going to go to the lawyer's office and I'm going to draw up a covenant between me and my children that when I die, they're going to get. About a year or so later, I decide, that's not such a good idea. I'm going to go back and draw up another covenant. And I go and I make a new covenant. What happens to the old? It's dissolved. It no longer is in effect. And so we've got that situation, that legality situation that the book of Hebrews talks about, that we're going to be talking about that too. This talks about the dispensations. What is a dispensation? Period of time that is delineated by some kind of a factor. There was the patriarchal dispensation, for instance, when God spoke to the fathers or the heads of the families. Then there was the Mosaical dispensation when God spoke through the writings of Moses and the prophets. And then there is the Christian dispensation, which is the last dispensation that there will be. Covenants and law, we've talked about that. So now we begin thinking about, what is binding? What is left? And that's a good question. So we're going to begin with Sabbath. The Hebrew word is pronounced Shabbath. That's the way my Bible dictionary pronounced it when I told it to pronounce it, Shabbath. Josephus explains it is a rest from all labor. Now, if it is a rest from all labor, what can you do? You can't work. You can only rest. It was defined in the Old Testament as the 7th day of the Hebrew week. And did you know that the Bible is the only place where a week is defined? All these cultures around the world have got their ways and means, and they go by lunar months. They count the days by the sun. But there is no culture, except for in the Bible, that defines a week. And it was it was defined where? Genesis. What was the occasion? The creation. Okay. The Sabbath extended from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. Now you've got a little problem here, for instance. It's getting darker now than it did in June. And the sun came up earlier in June than it does now. So what happened to that Sabbath? It changed, the length of time changed as the seasons changed. Let's go even more than that. If you go north, what happens to the length of the days? It gets shorter. If you go more towards the equator, what happens? It gets longer. Okay? So you've got this, what time do you start keeping the Sabbath? From sunset to sunset is when it happened. It began and ended with the sound of a trumpet being blown. And if it was in Jerusalem, it was blown from the temple roof. And I can just imagine the old priest climbing up on the roof and blowing that trumpet across Jerusalem. I live in Paris, and we have tornado sirens. I have to go outside and listen very carefully for me to hear the tornado sirens. Now, I don't know whether that hill is blocking it. I don't know why. But I got to thinking that Jerusalem is built on 7 hills. And, wonder if they had any trouble hearing when the trumpet blew. And somebody down at Springville said, and if you were busy making something or doing something in the field or tending to your flock, I wonder if they fudged a little bit and just kept on going and finished it. I don't know. Sunset to sunset and a trumpet blown to start it. It was a holy day. In Exodus chapter 10, and I give you these verses there on your outline, but I don't give you what it says. But the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work. Something you do to honor God by refraining from work. Now, by the time you get to Jesus' day, what has happened to you shall do no work? What did the people do? Well, now you can't lift up that pen off that pulpit on the Sabbath day because that's work. You can't do this or you can't do that. That's work. So it was expanded greatly by the priest and the Levites. In Exodus 34, verse 21 says, 6 days thou shalt work, but on the 7th day thou shalt rest. In earing time and in harvest thou shalt rest. What does it say about, I got a crop in the field, it's got to come out? What does it say? No, it doesn't. It'll wait one more day. I got hay on the ground, it's got to be baled. What does it say? No, it doesn't. You leave it laying right there. So God was very specific in what he demanded out of the people. Deuteronomy 5:14. But in the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work. Not do any work, excuse me. Who's the Sabbath belong to? Look at that close. The 7th day is the Sabbath of who? The Lord. It's God's Sabbath. And because it is God's Sabbath, you shall not work. But I don't want you to confuse the Sabbath day of the Jews, in which they worshiped, with the Sabbath of God, because there is a difference. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, God rested after the creation was finished. And you remember the days. On the first day he did this, created the heavens and the earth, and then he divided the waters in the day and the night, and on he went until ultimately, what was the last thing in creation? He created man and woman. Yeah, created man and woman. And when he was finished, he said, hey, this is good stuff. And he rested. But that rest was not given to man. We're going to see that in just a minute. The first time it was given to man is in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. What is in Exodus chapter 20? The Ten Commandments. The first time the Ten Commandments are given, and this is the first time it is given to man to keep the Sabbath day. And he said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. When it says the word remember there, it is indicative of an action in which you do something. The thing that you do is keep it holy. It is not intellectual remembrance, even though that's involved. It is prepare yourself and observe or keep the things that I tell you to do on that day. It'll include worship and sacrifices and a whole lot of other things. But you take care that remembrance there is not intellectual. It has to do with you preparing yourself to come before God. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work. Okay? Who owns the Sabbath? The Lord owns the Sabbath. The reason for giving this was made clear in verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, if they knew about the Sabbath before this, why was he having to tell them why they were having to keep it? If it was something that everybody kept, why was he having to make known unto Israel, the people of God, that they should keep it? Who was keeping it if they weren't? Nobody was. Okay, so we're going to see that God only gave it to them, and he only gave it to them from Mount Sinai at the time of the giving of the commandments. So on your outline, the Sabbath was given to Israel only. In Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 through 18, we're going to run through it quickly with you. Verse 13, God told Moses, speak unto the children of Israel. Tell them, ye shall keep the Sabbath. Who shall keep the Sabbath? Children of Israel. Else you shall be put to death. Penalty for not keeping the Sabbath was death. Verse 16, wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath. I don't know how much plainer that can be. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Now, what if I am not a descendant of Abraham? Does the Sabbath apply? No, it does not apply. Okay. Nehemiah chapter 9 verses 13 through 14 speaks about what God had done for Israel, how he had blessed them. It says he came down on Mount Sinai. When was it? When he came down on Mount Sinai. He gave them judgments, laws, statutes, and commandments, and made known unto them thy holy Sabbath. God said, the time I made known was when I came down on Mount Sinai. Was it known before? Exodus says no. Nehemiah here says no, it was not known before. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 12. It is what God said he had done for Israel. Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. Two things out of this that I want you to go away with. And the first one is, it's stated here again that this is between two things, God and Israel. The second thing is that when they would keep the Sabbath, they would know something. They would know about God. But more than that, they would know about the Lord. Now we've got to do some definition here. Do you see how that Lord is written there? I didn't put that emphasis on that. The translators did. Do you know what it means when you see capital Lord? Every letter is capital. It is God, but it is a special characteristic of God. It is Jehovah. And Jehovah is the description of God that means I will always keep my word. And so he says, I want them to know me as Jehovah, the covenant keeper. Oh, he was giving them the covenant, wasn't he? So let's see what is required in keeping the Sabbath. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 2 and Mark 2:23, Jesus came picking corn. It probably was wheat. And they got all over him. You can't do that on the Sabbath day. Now, why couldn't he do that on the Sabbath day? In their minds, it was because it was work. You can't reap your fields on the Sabbath day. And remember, in earing or in harvest, you can't work. And he was harvesting. That's against God's law. Matthew chapter 12, verse 10. He healed somebody there at the temple. And, it's the Sabbath day. You can't heal on the Sabbath day. In John chapter 5, verse 10, Jesus told the man to take your bed and rise up and walk. He did. They got on to the man. It's a Sabbath day. You can't carry the bed. Now here's the deal. Before Jesus had healed him, he carried the bed in there on the Sabbath day in all probability, and it was okay because he was a cripple. He couldn't he couldn't get around and move, and it's okay. If you were crippled, they approved that you carry something. You could carry a bed. But Jesus had healed him. And now that he's healed, he can't carry that bed. Do you think that was God's law? No, it wasn't. Because Jesus approved the lifting of a fallen sheep or ox from the pit. Yeah, you help your animals. On the Sabbath day, you were to go to worship. And two passages there when Jesus read during the service on the Sabbath day in the synagogues. They partook of meals. And if it was one of those special feasts, they had special clothing they had to wear. For instance, guys, you had to wear blue. Oh, that's not all. You had to wear blue with white lace around it. Gerald, where's your blue? Where's your lace? Yeah. It was a day of rest to honor the Lord in Leviticus 23:32. It is one thing for me to come to worship because that's what we do in our family. Because that's what everybody else is doing. Because I want to go down there and see so-and-so. I like the fellowship. I enjoy the services. I enjoy listening to the speaker. I enjoy the singing. I like, I want, and so on. None of that is scriptural. We're to go to the services. We're to worship our God, to honor Him. Just put that in the back of your mind. On the Sabbath days when the offering was made, a sacrifice. It depended upon the time of the year and what Sabbath it was as to what kind of a sacrifice was made. Could have been 12 loaves of bread with frankincense, meat offerings. But Christ is now our sacrifice, and there is none other sacrifice authorized. The book of Hebrews says, once and for all. Well, that's right, but except if you're a part of the body of Christ. And if you're a part of the body of Christ, self must be offered up. Do anybody remember the passage? I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service or your personal worship. That offering of self is continual, isn't it? And the book of Hebrews says, it is by the fruit of your lips and the giving of thanksgiving. We just come through the Thanksgiving time. And last Sunday I heard a really, really good lesson from Philippians chapter 4. Whatsoever things are pure and holy and just and so on. Think on these things. And the guy said, you can go through life dwelling on your negatives, your problems, your where you failed, and all of those kinds of negativities, and you will never be able to give thanks properly to God. Or you can go through life thinking on the things that are positive and thinking on the things that you've been blessed with, and you will be giving thanks, and those problems that you have will become minimal. So, how do you go through Thanksgiving? Is there anybody here who doesn't have something to be thankful for tonight? I can tell you no. Everybody here can be thankful for something, even if it's just for Jesus. So let's close it down. Here's what we've gone through tonight. The Sabbath was given by God to the Israelite nation. Was it given to you? The answer to that is no, not unless you become a Jew. It was not given to you. You were not commanded by God to keep it. It was a sign between Israel and God only. Not to anybody else. And they had to keep it, or they were to be stoned to death. There was some dress prescribed. There were some sacrifices prescribed. There was no work to be done except if it was to help an animal. Worship was to be done without fail. Not a choice. It was not a freedom. It was commanded by God. It was demanded by the priest, and you had to do it. You could not fast on the Sabbath day. Why? Because in fasting, you are depriving yourself from the blessing of God. You're not giving yourself to God. You cannot leave any of the sacrifice till the next day. Did you know that they ate those sacrifices? If it was a sin offering, the priest got it. But on those daily sacrifices, those weekly sacrifices, they had to eat it. And nothing could be left of it. They had to eat it all. But now Jesus is our sacrifice. And we come here and we take a communion, eating the emblems to remember his body and his blood. And we take it all in. He has become our Sabbath rest. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He is our sacrifice forever and forever. Amen.